afternoon, folks. Live from the Sweet Springs Nature Preserve. This is going to be our first field trip. Here we're at Sweet Springs and I see our first organism. This is a western fence lizard. He's a little cold here, looking for some sun to warm up. One of the things we'll be learning about the whole semester is native species, and that's definitely one of them. Alright, let's walk into the preserve here. Of course, they stopped allowing pets right about the time I got my dog. It's only been about 2 years or so. They stopped allowing pets in here, but they were causing lots of damage and pooping, and people weren't picking it up. So that's why they stopped allowing them. So anyhow, the Sweet Springs Nature Preserve has been here for almost 50 years. This area historically was used by the Native Americans. In this area, it was the Chumash Native Americans and possibly even the Selenians. And so this area was used for perhaps thousands of years, really, as a place for the Native Americans. It's called Sweet Springs because there is a freshwater spring which dumps in. We'll be seeing that here in a little bit. And of course, this was a precious source of fresh water for the Native Americans that lived right along the coast. So it's a very unique habitat because there is a freshwater spring immediately adjacent to where we find the Morro Bay estuary. So we'll be walking down there a little bit later. So the history of this area was that when the Spanish explorers first came here, of course they probably used the Sweet Springs water too. But eventually, as people started to settle the area, this was the location of a duck hunting club. And so for about the 1920s until the 1940s, there was a duck hunting club here. Actually was a physical club, and duck blinds down by the water there. We'll be walking down there in a little bit. And so people hunted out in the bay for different types of duck and geese and things like that. Well, the duck hunting club burnt down in the 40s. And eventually this property was purchased by Al Schweitzer of the Morro Palisades Group. And they developed some of this area right off the bat. And they built this mobile home park across the street here. And they had intentions of developing this area too. They were going to come in here and build houses and totally develop this area. But it took them a while to come up with some funding. They weren't able to really secure adequate funding at that time. And the Morro Coast Audubon Society came in and decided to purchase this area to protect it. So initially they purchased 24 acres. It extends from this area here to the east, all the way across here over to that area way over there. So it's about 24 acres. And this area was purchased to preserve this habitat for the organisms that live here and for humans to be able to come here. And as you can see, we've already had a few folks walking by and exploring this area. About 5 years ago, they actually expanded the preserve another 8 acres, and we'll be visiting that location a little bit later in the field trip. So now this area is protected. And one of the things that makes this area so special is all the native organisms that we see here. So it's going to be pointing them out along the field trip. Over here, this yellow flowering bush is called Coreopsis. You can see how large that bush is. Down here is one of my favorite local plants. This plant down here is called hummingbird sage. And a lot of times when you're out here, you'll see hummingbirds actually feeding on these flowers. They have a lot of nectar in them. So beautiful flowers. So this is a true sage, and if you press on its leaves, it's very aromatic. And so yeah, when you smell it, it smells absolutely delicious. And so those leaves, that aromatic smell, even though it smells good to us, it's actually not good for other organisms to eat. So a lot of times those very fragrant aromatic compounds that we have in plants, they do smell good to us, and we use them as spices and things like that, but herbivores, you know, deer and rabbits and things like that, they actually don't like those things, and so they won't eat them. So moving over here, we see a coast live oak. And this would have been the native tree in this area, the coast live oak. And we can see there's a few small ones here. These have been reintroduced back into this area. The big trees that we see here, these ones all over to this side of the park, are Monterey cypress. And while Monterey cypress are native to California, they're not actually native to this part of the Central Coast. So there's lots of them in here. They're an introduced species, but we wouldn't call them an invasive species because at least they are native to California, and the organisms here have evolved with these trees, and so they can adapt and live with them. Even though they're not to this specific area, they are native to California at least. Here's another coast live oak. This tree's probably 6 to 8 years old or so. As we walk down the trail a little bit, we see another native local species. This is another sage. Oftentimes you can tell the sage by the flowers that come off on stalks towards the top of the plant, just like the hummingbird sage had. And once again, if we squeeze these leaves and smell them, they have a really nice smell to them. So as we move over here, we see some more native species. Here we have a endemic species. This will be one of the questions on your question sheet here, is what are endemic species? Well, endemic species are native species, but they are a species that has a very narrow range. What I mean by that is they live in a fairly small part of an area, and this is in fact the Morro manzanita, which means that it lives in a very restricted part of this Morro Bay area. And we can see this bark on here is not your normal type of manzanita, and this is what makes it different from the California manzanita like you might find up in the Cuesta Ridge area. And the bark is kind of fuzzy. You can see kind of grayish bark on there. A lot of you probably recognize manzanita as a wood that's very red and smooth, so that's what makes this one different. Who knows what manzanita means? So manzanita is a Spanish word that means little apples, and maybe later on we'll see another manzanita that has a small fruit on it that looks like a little apple basically. So moving further into the preserve, another native plant that we can see over here is the sage. So this is the California sagebrush. Once again, squeezing its leaves and smelling that. Very aromatic, but that's actually not a true sage. You can see it doesn't really look similar to the other sages that we saw, and so that is actually more closely related to mint, but it smells like sage, and so people called it sage even though it's not a true sage. That's California sagebrush. So sometimes common names are good, but at times common names are bad because it might confuse you about what exactly the relationship is to other organisms. So as we can see, there's lots of wildlife that lives in this area. All these birds on this screen here have been spotted at one time or another within the preserve. So I think what we'll do is take a spin around this way. I'm going to pause it for just a second and put something away. All right, so we're kind of getting past the Monterey cypress here. There's a few more coast live oaks that have been planted in this area. Some fairly small ones and some maybe a few years old. These ones are probably 4 or 5 years old. So they have had to come in and physically plant these trees. They weren't getting any native regeneration happening. And one of the odd things you'll see in this preserve is you'll see drip line. Oh, that one's not doing well at all. That one's actually died. So it might be unusual to see a drip line in a preserve, but they're just trying to give these native plants that they've put in here a little bit of a head start. If they didn't have the drip line in there, the trees may not make it, and so they're just giving a little bit of a head start by putting these drip lines in and watering these They only need to water them probably for a year or two. Once they're established, they won't need any more water because they are native and adapted to these areas. So the big trees here, you probably recognize these, right? These are the ones the koala bears could live in. This would be the start of our Koalifornia. Right, these are the eucalyptus trees from Australia. And so these eucalyptus trees were introduced here a couple hundred years ago. They initially had brought the eucalyptus trees in for lumber. They grow really fast and they can make good lumber, but apparently they brought in the wrong type, and they almost grow so fast that their wood is quite brittle when you try and make lumber out of it. So it didn't make very good lumber. People then started to plant them in areas as windbreaks because they grow so fast and tall so quickly. They do make good windbreaks because they're such big trees. But one of the things we'll notice as we get further into this forest is that there's lots of woody debris on the ground. The leaves and the bark constantly slough off the trees. And it's really amazing adaptation of the trees themselves, and the fact that this duff or this debris that comes off of the trees has tannic acids in it. And these tannic acids, when they fall on the ground, they actually prevent the growth of other organisms. So when you get into a dense eucalyptus forest, you actually won't see anything at all growing on the ground, or maybe just a few things that are really hardy that actually can withstand that tannic acid. So you can see the places where the forest is really thick and there's a lot of that woody bark and leaves on the ground, there really isn't much living in these areas at all. And so this is what we call an invasive species, right? These are non-native. These are invasive in the fact that they can spread really quickly, and they also outcompete the native organisms. So we call this competitive exclusion. So competitive exclusion means that a non-native organism usually comes into an area, and because it doesn't have the normal checks and balances of the native ecosystem, it can just totally dominate. And because there's no organisms that are going to affect it, there's no natural diseases that's going to keep it in check, it can just proliferate and literally take over entire ecosystems. And that's really what they've done here. Now, this is not what this ecosystem should look like. There's a stretch in a little while that I'll show you that what this area should look like, but this is not what it should look like. Interestingly enough, the Audubon Society actually tried to cut these down about 15-20 years ago, but the people around here love the trees so much because they're so beautiful that they petitioned the county not to allow them to cut the trees down. And one of the things they said was like, well, these trees have been here for 200 years. They're native now. And to say that to a biologist just really makes them laugh, because these organisms that are native in these ecosystems have lived here for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And to think that an organism is going to magically become native within a couple hundred years is really quite silly. So unfortunately, they were not allowed to cut these trees down. When they fall down, they remove them. They don't allow new ones to grow up, but these trees live a long time, and there will always most likely be trees here. So one of my favorite plants in the preserve is this one over here. This is a bush lupin, sometimes called a silver bush lupin, and this is a native species. Lupin may sound like a familiar word for you, and there's a lot of lupin plants. And these are really important to these areas because they have the amazing ability to fix nitrogen and make their own fertilizer, which is really cool. They have a symbiotic bacteria that live within their root systems. And there's these bacteria able to actually take the nitrogen out of the air and convert it into fertilizer. That's really cool. So we call that mutualism, right? When two organisms are helping each other out. All right, hopefully everybody recognizes this plant. And of course, as the sign comes into view, that is poison oak. All right, so there's a little rhyme, and you may have heard of it before, is if you see leaves of 3, let it be. But that's not always the best, because there's actually a tasty berry around here, a native blackberry, that also has leaves of 3. So really, the better rhyme for this one is leaves of 3, let it be. But if it's hairy, it's a berry. But if it's shiny, don't wipe your hiney. That would not be good. All right, so from here over is the additional 8 acres that was recently added to the preserve, and we'll be hitting that towards the end. But that is the expansion there, the east expansion as they call it. You see the Audubon Society and some other partners have a sign up placed there, and they've done a lot of restoration work there in the last couple of years. So we'll continue down this way. We can scan over here and see the actual Sweet Springs where it comes out of the ground. So the natural ecosystem here did not have this big pond. This pond was dug out by the Duck Hunting Club. This was put in place to help attract ducks to a freshwater habitat right next to the bay. And it does work. Oftentimes you come down in here and there are lots of ducks within that habitat. The native, or the original habitat, would have been more like what we see up here. This spring up here, this marshland, wetland habitat, that would have been what was naturally here. And we can see the water flowing just right out of the ground here. So the geology, the water is coming down from the hillside. It's hitting some type of a bedrock layer in here, which prevents it from filtering down any further. And then it comes right up to the surface here and flows out into the bay. We see our other leaves of 3 here. You can see lots of blooms on this because this is a native wild blackberry. And when you look closely at it, let's see if I can get a good, yeah, here you go, good leaf here. Good, you can see that it's hairy, right? These aren't sharp yet. They will get sharp as it gets older. But even on the leaves themselves, you see the leaves. You can see that. The leaves themselves have lots of little hairs on them too. So leaves of 3, let it be. If it's hairy, it's a berry, and that's tasty. But once again, if it's shiny, don't wipe that hiney. All right, another cool thing we're seeing on this plant here are these little red kind of blisters. Look at those things. All right, these things are called galls, G-A-L-L. And a gall is formed on a plant after an insect lays its eggs on there. This is a willow tree. Willow trees are a wetland or a riparian type of a plant. And a little wasp, there's a little wasp species that lives in this area, and it lays its egg on the leaf. The egg hatches out and it starts to chew on the leaf, and it irritates the plant, and the plant literally sort of encapsulates that with this gall-like structure. And so what happens is that the larvae actually develop within the gall, and the gall serves as its food. So it's a really interesting piece of evolution. This would be more of a commensal type relationship. It's not really parasitism because they aren't really parasitizing and harming the tree. They're just living kind of on the tree. And so these galls, eventually you'll see a little insect, and this one, we can look in there and see that hole right on the end there? Right in there, there's a hole. And that's where the adult hatched out. So once the larvae got done metamorphosing into an adult, that's where the adult hatched out and then flew away to start the life cycle over again. So we'll continue down this way, get closer to the pond area. See, we have a lot of poison oak over here to the right. Towering eucalyptus trees all around, dropping their leaves and their branches. As these drop into the water, they do affect the pH of the water. The pH of the little pond here is lower than it would be naturally because of the tannic acids that are leaking into the pond that are coming out of the leaves and the bark. So not a lot of water flowing in here, but it's a significant amount. Certainly if you were a Native American or an early settler, this would have been a vital source of fresh water for you to be able to have something that close to the bay. You know, and the bay is just right on the other side here. So of course, lots and lots of food could be harvested from the bay. So this is a great place to live, not only for the early Native Americans, but the settlers too. And in fact, I live just about 4 blocks over there. So it's pretty cool. I can walk over here in about 10 minutes or so from my house, and I'm in a pretty nice place here. As we walk further down, you'll start to see, well, actually I'm not seeing them today, but usually we see some ducks in here. I'm not seeing any today. There are some little fish moving around in there. There are 2 threatened species that we do find in this habitat. I'm not seeing them right now, but at times I have seen turtles in here, and there is a native turtle called the southwestern pond turtle that is native to this area, and that is a threatened species. And the other one is the California red-legged frog, and that is also a threatened species. So this habitat, once again, is really important for the local species. We've talked about in class, you know, half or more of California's wetlands have been filled in at some point in time. And so this habitat is vitally important for these organisms because wetland habitat is just very, very limited for the most part in the state of California and throughout the world. We're destroying a lot of our native wetland habitat. Oftentimes you'll be hiking through here and you'll see deer out in this area. So as soon as we come off of this edge here and drop down, we get into this habitat called the salt marsh. Right, so up here, we're in an area where no salt is coming up in these plants. So these are all terrestrial plants that can't withstand really any salt inundation at all. We'll walk out on this bridge here and give you an idea of, once again, the amount of water that's moving out of this little pond. So not a huge amount of water. I don't know if you can see, but there's actually quite a few little fish swimming along there. Pretty small fish. Difficult to tell the species. My guess is they're some type of juvenile, maybe bay smelt, could be mullet or something like that. So a smaller type of fish. This can be affected by the tides. So generally this is 100% fresh water. But when we get our big tides of the year, how many of you guys have ever heard of king tides? That's basically during the winter time when the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon are greater, and you get higher tides during the winter time. When that happens, the tide can come up. So there's a channel that goes all the way down to the bay over there. When the tide comes up really high, it can actually push salt water back up into this pond and make it more like brackish water. It wouldn't be entirely ocean water because it's still mixing with the fresh water that's in there, but it would be a brackish water type of situation there. And that just means intermediate salinities. Ocean water is about 35 parts per thousand. Fresh water's less than 1 parts per thousand. Brackish waters, 12 to 16 parts per thousand, something like that. So as we walk down here to the edge of the salt marsh, we're going to see a very distinct line. Look at this very distinct line that we're seeing here, where we have our terrestrial plants up here. So these are our terrestrial plants up here, and then we have some salt marsh plants just like right on the edge. So these can withstand just a little bit of saltwater inundation. And then we get down here and we have our true salt marsh plants. And what you can see as you scan out over this area is that it's dominated by only one species in this particular spot. There sometimes can be a couple other species out here, but this is really dominated by one single species of plant, and this plant is called pickleweed. I don't know if folks have heard of pickleweed before, but pickleweed is a succulent. I'll pick a leaf off here. It's a succulent, and you'll see that a lot of the leaves have turned red. So once they turn red, that means they've lost their photosynthetic capabilities. But what's happened there is that since these plants live in the salt water, they're taking it up, and you have to have special adaptations to get rid of that salt. And so what these plants do is they shed these leaves after a while. So these red leaves eventually will just fall off, and that's because they're just very high concentration of salt. And when you eat the pickleweed, which if you're ever down here, you certainly can, but you can eat the pickleweed, and it tastes very salty. It doesn't taste good. I just meant it tasted salty. So the pickleweed sort of looks like a pickle, tastes like a pickle, and that's why they call it pickleweed. All right. So we'll continue walking down the trail here. You can see this area gets quite a bit of use. As we scan over towards the bay, we can see that the tide is dropping quite low today. I didn't look at the tide book today, but I can pull out my handy dandy tide pool app on my phone, and we can check and see what the tide is doing. So yeah, so we can see it's a this is Port San Luis, but it's pretty much the same here in Morro Bay. It's a negative 0.25 foot low tide, and the arrow is going up, so that means the tide is actually coming back in. We had our low tide, actually it was right at 3:50, so 3:50 p.m. We had at negative 0.25. This morning it was a 5 foot high tide. Pretty impressive, right? So that's a little over a 5 foot vertical change in water within the Morro Bay estuary. That's a lot of water, right? We're talking millions and millions of gallons of water that has drained out of the bay here in about the last 6 hours. So we generally have 4 tides a day along the Central Coast. We have 2 high tides and 2 low tides, and they're of different height. So we call these types of tides a mixed semi-diurnal tide. And that just means that there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides, but the high tides are of different heights and the low tides are of different heights. There's a higher high tide and a lower low tide. Some places around the world are called semi-diurnal, and they have 2 highs and 2 lows, but the highs are the same and the lows are the same. And then some places have what we call diurnal. And that just means we have 1 high tide and 1 low tide throughout the day. If you've been in marine biology or taken oceanography or something like that, you've probably talked a lot about the tides, and they can get really confusing. There's a lot of geographic differences and whatnot. For example, the tides in the Morro Bay estuary can be about an hour later than what the tides would be out at Morro Beach. So if you were in Cayucas and the tide was, high tide, let's say it was at 3:30, when you came into the bay, you might expect that tide to be 4:15 or 4:30. So that's quite a bit of change from the open ocean into the bay. And that's just because there's a small opening at the mouth of the bay, and it takes a little while for the water to filter back in here. As we walk down this other part of the boardwalk here, we can see that there are some deer out here. As I mentioned before, it's not too uncommon to see deer out in the salt marsh. So they're out here feeding on the grasses and whatnot in the salt marsh. I believe these are white-tailed deer, but I'm not a hunter, so I'm not 100% positive about that. But they are in here, and it's cool to see because we're so close to lots of houses. I mean, there's houses all back in this area, and here we have some deer. You know, I have friends with cats who've disappeared, and more than likely it's probably coyotes that are taking them. I'm going to pause it here as some folks approach so I can keep my proper social distancing. Here's more of our friend, the poison oak. Lots of poison oak around here. Here's some more of the fake sage. This is once again, the California sagebrush, but not a true sage. Once again, it's related more to the mint family. So we'll see this sign here shows you how important the Morro Bay estuary is to birds. So we see that we're on what we call the Pacific Flyway here. So the Pacific Flyway is a zone where birds migrate from northern latitudes to either our temperate latitudes or even further south, possibly all the way down into South America. And so lots of birds migrate long distances, but other ones just stay here year round. A good example of one that migrates long distances here is the black brant. This is a type of a goose, and it actually nests up here in the Aleutian Islands and up on the north slope of Alaska. During the summertime, it's breeding up there, and then during the winter, it comes all the way down to the Morro Bay estuary to feed. And it's interesting because it eats one type of plant. It's an herbivore, and it only eats eelgrass, which is interesting because not many things actually eat eelgrass. Eelgrass is a pretty hard, fibrous plant, and not many things can actually consume it. The eelgrass in Morro Bay estuary has been doing very poorly in recent times. Back in the early 2000s, there was as much as 400 acres of eelgrass within the estuary, but unfortunately it got to a low point in 2016 of only 9 acres. Yes, 9 acres. They lost over 90% of the eelgrass within the estuary. There's been a lot of restoration work done, and we'll talk more about that later on, but the restoration work has finally brought it back to about 35, 36 acres, and thank goodness it's still increasing. But the eelgrass has been a huge story, and there's been a lot of work done trying to restore the bay. So a couple shorebirds. So these are shorebirds here. We got yellowlegs. This is greater yellowlegs. There's also a lesser yellowlegs. Several different species of sandpipers. This is a least sandpiper. This is a western sandpiper. Also lots of species of plovers. This is a black-bellied plover, although when we see them here, they don't have that black belly. And then probably my favorite one is the long-billed curlew. So these shorebirds feed along the shore. Sometimes scientists make sense with their names. And the shorebirds feed on little invertebrates, snails, shrimp, things like that are in the mud. And even though oftentimes they're feeding in the same locations, we can look at them here and see how short of a bill this one has. This one here has a little bit of a longer bill. The sandpiper is a little bit longer bill, but it's still fairly short. The yellowlegs a little bit longer still. And then the long-billed curlew has a really long bill. So these organisms, even though they are feeding in the same location, they actually don't compete with each other. And we call this resource partitioning. So resource partitioning means that you're partitioning up the resource, you're feeding on different organisms, and you're not competing directly with each other. The long-billed curlew has an even more amazing adaptation here. You can see maybe on this video, the very tip of its bill looks a little funky there. And that's because it has what's called a prehensile bill. You may have heard about how monkeys have a prehensile tail that allows them to, to grab onto trees when they're moving through trees. Well, a prehensile bill allows the curlews, as they move that bill down into the mud, if you had that bill's about 6 inches long. As you get down on the mud, it'd be difficult to move it around or grab something. So if it feels food, it can just close that end of the bill and then pull that organism out of there. Oftentimes it's a little shrimp, a little worm, something like that. And so that prehensile bill really allows the long-billed curlew to feed down in the depths. So this is a good low tide in the bay. This is a negative low tide, and as you can see, a lot of the bay has drained out. Directly across there, that's the town of Baywood. There's a little hotel over there, bed and breakfast. La Palapa is over there, my favorite Mexican food restaurant. Noy's Thai food used to be over there, although now they're in this place called 2nd Street Thai food. And it is fantastic. A couple of old Thai ladies back in there making some delicious food. Don't order the hot, because let me tell you, it is hot, but it is some good stuff. Across the way there we can see the dunes. That's the sand spit. The sand spit's about 4 miles long. It starts in Montana de Oro State Park over there, and it extends all the way across, all the way almost to Morro Rock over there. It's about 4.5 miles long, and that's all part of Morro Bay State Park. So we obviously can see Morro Rock off in the distance there, and we can see the Morro Bay Power Plant. I'll talk more about that later, but the Morro Bay Power Plant, there were those 3 tall stacks. That is an important part of the history of Morro Bay too. So that brings up a reminder for folks. Maybe you're not from this area and you don't know about the local gangs that we have here. So if you're ever someplace and you see somebody flash this sign, that's the 3 stacks and a rock gang, and you better steer clear. This is some serious business when you run into the 3 stacks and a rock gang. Of course, I am just kidding. All right, so once again, repetition breeds definition. We've got our California sagebrush over there. We've got our leaves of 3, let it be because it's shiny. We're never ever gonna wipe our hiney. We've got these horrible eucalyptus trees over here with no koalas, so we can't make any money off of them by having Koalifornia. As we move down over here, oh, the deer have moved off into the brush. We can see some native sedges here. Sedges are a marshland plant, so you know this is very wet through here. So those are all native sedges. Move down a little bit further here. We're starting to get back into some of these Monterey cypress. So the Monterey cypress are planted throughout this zone. Once again, non-native to the Central Coast, but they are native to California. So even though there's no organisms around here that would have evolved with them, there's still lots of them that would have been around them in Monterey and places like that. So a little bit more of our eucalyptus forest here. As we walk out, this is the entrance to the preserve. And I was hoping you would see this bird, but since we didn't, I do want to point it out. This is one of my favorite birds that we find along the coast here. This is called a belted kingfisher. And as you can imagine, they're good at fishing. And they do have what we call sexual dimorphism. Lots of fancy words here, but all that means is that males and females look different, and humans have sexual dimorphism. So here's the female kingfisher over here, and here's the male kingfisher over there. They are a lot of fun to watch. They are very territorial. So as you're hiking around where there are kingfishers, you generally hear them before you see them. They have a really loud, like a rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat call, and because they're so territorial, they defend these areas very aggressively. So when another bird comes in there, especially if it's another kingfisher, you hear them calling out really loudly and chasing the other birds, and they have like aerial dog fights and chasing each other around. It's really quite entertaining to see. And then when they feed, of course, they're really good at seeing into the water. A lot of birds like ospreys and kingfishers and things like that, they have a polarization within their lenses that allows them to see into the water very well. And because of that, they can hunt fish and see things that other birds would just not be able to see under the surface. So the kingfishers are definitely the fisher kings. So this area that we're getting into here, a couple homes off to the right, we got another bush looping over here, and we can see they're just getting ready. These are going to be the flowers here, and these flower blooms, these flower stalks can be quite high. So that's the silver bush lupin, and probably another couple weeks, maybe another month, we're going to see those blooming, and they are a really beautiful plant when they're blooming. So I'll cruise along over here, and I really wanted to show you this part because this area is probably what all of this area looked like before it was developed and before they planted the cypress and the eucalyptus, and that's this area here. So this area off to the left has a lot of different types of native plants in it, and it's kind of a low shrubby type of an ecosystem. These here are called, it's called coyote, I'm sorry, deer brush. We can see we have some more of the Moro manzanita over here. We got the California sagebrush. We got the black sage. As we come over here, we're going to get a good look at the Moro manzanita. And when we look closely at it, we finally get to see those little apples. So these here look like little apples, and that's how the Moro manzanita got its name. Oh, there's a vine growing up in here. Ooh, bird just took off. I didn't see what it was though. This vine going across here. Oh, you can see it does have a little fruit. This is a native wild cucumber. The fruit is actually not edible, but I think the Native Americans had a use for it. I'm not familiar with what that use was though. As we get a little further in, we see more of the vine, more of the Moro manzanita. But this over here is the buckwheat. Lots of names going through my head. Yeah, this is the California buckwheat. All right, so California buckwheat, it's another native. We can see some of them are just getting ready to bloom there. More of the Moro manzanita, California buckwheat. All this is buckwheat. So sometimes when a native plant gets established in an area, it can sometimes, you know, competitively exclude other plants because it's doing so well in a specific zone. Oh, beautiful. All right, another one of my favorite local plants. This one is called sticky monkey flower. It apparently has a name monkey flower because the flowers look like a monkey. I don't know. Do you see it? I don't really see it, but anyway, that's what they're called. So they call them sticky monkey flower because if you feel the leaves are pretty sticky. And you can grab one just to demonstrate that, and they stick to you, right? So sticky monkey flower. So you know, if you grab one of these things and it sticks on your forehead, you know that's the sticky monkey flower. All right, I see a beautiful yellow flower over here, but I can't remember the name of it. I don't expect you guys to know the name of everything either. There's a lot of organisms out here. But what I do have, and what you could all use, is something called iNaturalist. All right, so iNaturalist is a little app on your phone. And what you can do, it's really cool. You can just go up to a plant, or any organism actually, and take a picture of it. Right? And then it has this whole catalog. A lot of biologists and naturalists all over the place. I don't know if you guys can see that at all. That's a little bit better. So all these biologists and naturalists, they have inputted lots of names in here. And these are people that do know what they're looking at. So you can click on what did you see? And then what it's going to do is it's going to give you a list of organisms that look like that one. Let's see if it's this rocket flower here. Loading suggestions. And maybe a wallflower, Menzies wallflower. And it's cool because it'll say it's visually similar and it's been seen nearby. So that's likely it. That's likely a wallflower. Now, that's not 100% correct, but it might be. And it just gives you sometimes a good place to start when you're trying to figure out what these different types of plants or organisms are. So pretty cool. And you can share them. It'll upload it and you can share it. And the cool part about that is that there are people that go through these lists and they will verify it. And I've gotten texts or emails back from folks saying, hey, yeah, you were right in what you saw out there. And then other times they'll say, nope, it wasn't that. It was probably this other thing. All right, another native plant. I missed this one on the way in. This one is called Ceanothus. There's a variant of this that is a popular type of landscaping that folks use. The Native Americans called this soap plant. And apparently you could take these seeds here and grind them up, and you can get like a soap-like substance from it. So it's a very important plant once again for the Native Americans in this area. All right, I'm just gonna walk down this way here. Trying my best to keep my social distancing. So I'll have a list of questions for you guys, and basically you can play the video and rewind it and hopefully get all the answers to the questions. But I'll just kind of go back through them here. You can fast forward this part if you don't want. The history of the area, right? So the native Chumash and Selenian were the Native Americans that lived in this area, and they used it probably for thousands of years. Then when settlers came in here, they eventually established a duck hunting club that was in operation in the early 1900s until it burnt down in the 1940s. Then a developer bought it and was going to develop this land into housing and things like that. But then the Audubon Society came along and bought 24 acres initially, and that went from the sign right over there all the way down to where we went out overlooking the bay. And it's been owned by them for about 50 years. I don't know if you guys know Ron Rupert. He's the department head at Cuesta College, and he's actually on the deed apparently of this piece of property. He was part of the Audubon Society at that point, so that's pretty cool. Over here we got some more of the California sagebrush. Very nice. So we can continue walking over here. They actually just took out a 8-foot tall chain link fence that was all along this area, and they put in this much smaller low-rise fence. As we can see out in this area, they've done a lot of planting of natives. So a lot of non-native grasses had taken over this habitat, and so they have gone in, removed the non-natives, and they're replanting the native plants within that zone. So it's a great place to go hiking at. Come down here every once in a while. I used to come down here more until I got a dog, and then right about when I got a dog, they stopped allowing dogs in here. So I usually go to other places that allow dogs now. So as we get towards this part, and I'm about 2 blocks over that way. This is 5th Street. I live on 7th Street, just over there a little ways. Here's the silver bush lupin again. California sagebrush again. All right, so here's the sign for the entrance. This is kind of taken over as the main entrance because it's in an area that gets a lot more foot traffic. So you can see the major owner of this area is the Morro Coast Audubon. So notice the spelling there, and that's after the scientist, a famous birder named Audubon. But there's also lots of partners. These people help them purchase it. These people help protect it. These folks are continuing to help work on this property to restore it. So yeah, have some pretty good structures over here. They got a little water tank here for watering of the natives to get them established. They got a little shed over there to keep their tools, because there's a lot of work over here to keep this in shape. As we walk down here, once again we got more of the California sagebrush growing. Got the dune buckwheat down there. Got the wallflower, I believe, right there. Ooh, sticky monkey flower. Here we've got the black sage, California sagebrush. Ooh, here's another, I'm not sure what this is. This is another type of lupin. You can tell by those palm-shaped flower or leaves there. Right, so that's another type of lupin. I'm not sure what that one is, but you can tell how different it is with the red stems. So we'll continue down this way, looking at the beautiful native plants that have been established here. So water spigots and hoses. So some of the things you might not expect to see in a nature preserve, but you have to help them out. Otherwise, it's too easy for the non-natives to outcompete them. All right, so here's the snail that tells a lot of the story of this area and why this area was protected. This is another endemic species. So once again, an endemic species is an organism that has a very limited range. And the Moro shoulder band snail is an endangered species that's found within the Sweet Springs Preserve. And so this is one of the big reasons why they protected this area, was to preserve the habitat for the Moro band, the Moro shoulder band snail. And so the Moro shoulder band snail lives in a very small area along the coast here. Right, looks kind of like a garden snail, but it's not. So biggest impact for them, of course, is habitat destruction. So that's been a big impact on them. But also non-native species too. And we've been seeing these flowers, right? We've been seeing the hummingbird sage, sticky monkey flower, California sagebrush, dune buckwheat, the deerweed, and of course the dune or the bush lupin. So this Moro shoulder band snail, anytime you do any type of work within Los Osos or the Morro Bay area, you have to get special permits. You have to have biologists out there that are trained to identify, and if they happen to run across one, you can move it, but you have to have specially trained biologists there to be able to do that for you. As we come up to this sign here, once again, a big part of this area is for people, right? To bring kids out here, to get them excited about nature, or just get them the hell out of your house. Here we have another non-native that they're always talking about. This is the Sahara mustard. It's a highly invasive non-native, and they work very hard to try and remove these from the park. Over here we see a lot of birds that we might find within the nature preserve, and all of these have been seen right here in the Sweet Springs Preserve. All right, we can come down a little bit further. Once again, a lot more natives being planted, a lot of drip lines and whatnot being put in this area. Kind of wishing I wore my surgical mask, I guess. All right, so I think we've seen this sign already. This is just once again talking about the birds we can see around here. This is an important nesting area for lots of native birds. And oh hey, look at this. All right, so don't you at home cross this barrier, but I'm gonna come over here just to show you the blooming bush lupin, or the silver bush dune lupin. Lots of different common names for them, but if you smell this, and I recommend doing it sometime. Oh my goodness, it smells like grape Kool-Aid, I think. It's absolutely delicious smell. So whenever you see that plant, take a big whiff of it, and if you remember what grape Kool-Aid used to smell like, that's what this one smells like. All right, we're almost done with the field trip here, getting towards the end. I'll stop up here and make sure we've answered all the questions. So they've done quite a bit of restoration work on this side, haven't quite got to this side. Eventually they are going to be removing the non-native grasses here and planting some more natives. So this area towards the end, this was just completed a few years ago, And they wanted to have a nice boardwalk. Main reason for the boardwalk is to prevent the trampling of the native plants and just keep people focused on one pathway here. And they wanted to have a nice, beautiful overview so lots of people would use it. Once again, these areas are to inspire folks to get outside, to be in nature, to respect nature, and then hopefully to want to protect nature. But if you're building a bird blind that directly overlooks the bay, and some of the bird species in there are pretty skittish of people, you don't want to have a big opposing person come up, which could spook them. And so they created this bird blind, or this bird observation point. And this works out really well because it helps kind of shield you from the direct view of the birds, but still gives you plenty of room to be able to see the birds yourself. So once again, we can see the low tide out here. Out in the distance, you can see there's lots of shorebirds walking around in the mud, feeding on those aquatic invertebrates within the mud. But this bird blind does a good job of allowing people to observe the bay, to see the beautiful view, but just have a little bit less of an impact on the birds that they might encounter out here. All right, the Sweet Springs that we were at earlier is directly across the bay there. As I walk back, I'm just going to go through some of the questions here just to make sure. Why is the habitat unique? Right, so the habitat is unique because of the freshwater spring, aka Sweet Springs. So that Sweet Springs area is a unique habitat along the bay. This is a saltwater marsh, and immediately adjacent to that is a freshwater spring that comes out. So that's important for all sorts of organisms. And that's one of the things that makes this habitat so unique. The restoration, I've been talking about that the whole time. They've been planting lots of natives and removing a lot of non-natives, and it's a constant battle. Their work is never done. They're constantly having to remove the non-native species, especially the invasive ones, and then they're having to plant and oftentimes take care of the native ones. Now eventually the native ones will take care of themselves, but they do need a little bit of help getting established in this altered ecosystem. So really the major non-native species here, there's two of them. We have the cypress right above us here, Monterey cypress, and then of course the eucalyptus over there. As I mentioned before, the Monterey cypress, not as bad because at least it's from California, up in the Monterey region. But the eucalyptus is highly invasive. It's in this habitat. They won't let them get rid of it.